among the institutions that matter are also the international political institutions. By that I mean the rules, the behaviors, the laws, and other structures that help to shape how political institutions in different locations interact with each other. And we know that as long as there has been politics, there has been political interaction between different political units, and that interaction has sometimes been peaceful and cooperative, treaties and agreements, even mergers and alliances of different independent political groups, but also areas of conflict. Because as long as there have been political institutions, there have been wars between independent political institutions. These wars have shaped humanity. Indeed, we suspect, I think for good reason, that while the bands or those small foraging groups of the Paleolithic era were peaceful and egalitarian and very cooperative within these groups, were often at war with competing bands or competing groups over territory. Life was hard, and the rights to be able to forage in a particular location were matters of life and death. And so battles over those hunting grounds or over those foraging sites were also, therefore, occasions for strife. It is thought that in that long interaction of individual foraging bands defending their territory or turf vis-a-vis other bands, there was a kind of what evolutionary biologists call two-level selection, meaning that within communities, cooperation and trust was paramount, and between communities, conflict was pervasive, so that individuals learned two kinds of norms. One kind of norm was be cooperative and faithful and trustworthy within your group. But between groups, be ready for war and for hostility. In-group trust and altruism, outer group distrust and often conflict. And we see that structure of ideas and norms until today. Be loyal within your nation. Love your nation. But your nation must be on guard and ready to fight the other nation, or so we are told. And so international political institutions, institutions that govern the relations between polities or between political groupings, are institutions that also govern war versus peace. Even the idea of what is the right kind of war, or what is fair or unfair in war, what is just war or unjust war, even regulating killing by conventions that define what armies should or should not do, become part of the international institutions governing the relations among different political units. As far back as we have history, we have these political entities fighting each other. The two great early histories, first the histories written by Herodotus about the war between the Persians and the Greeks, define alliance of Greek city-states to defend themselves against the invading Persian Achaemenid Empire. And so we have both statecraft, alliances within Greek city-states, and we have conflict. And then the second great history of that era, Thucydides, the Peloponnesian Wars, describes two alliances, one around the city-state of Sparta and one around the city-state of Athens, battling with each other between the years 431 BCE and 404 BCE, eventually leading to the defeat of Athens in this multi-decade warfare between these two alliances of city-states. Well, war has been a feature of geopolitics or international relations between states for all of human history, and it remains very dangerously so till today. Beginning in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, attempts have been made to fashion a set of international laws that can govern interstate relations to reduce the chances of this dreadful warfare. And this has become more and more important as the instruments of war have become more and more powerful. Until today, in the nuclear age, we have not only the weapons to kill each other, but sufficient weaponry to destroy all life on the planet. And so the relations between governments and the ways to create behaviors and organizational forms and regulations to stop interstate warfare become more and more important. At the end of the 18th century, in 1795, the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant wrote a fascinating essay called Perpetual Peace, where he outlined what could be international rules between states and international organizational forms to lead to peace rather than war. In the 19th century, in fact, just as Immanuel Kant was writing Perpetual Peace, a new European-wide war was breaking out between revolutionary France, led by Napoleon, and the rest of Europe. And a new European war was breaking out, led by revolutionary France on one side, with Napoleon in the lead, and much of the rest of Europe on the other side. And those Napoleonic Wars, so-called, raged at the end of the 1790s and up until Napoleon's defeat in 1815. When Napoleon was defeated, the European powers that had defeated Napoleon met in Vienna, in what became called the Congress of Vienna, to try to set actual institutional rules to stop war in Europe. And the great powers of the time devised principles that would reduce conflict. In the 19th century, many of those principles that became a kind of balance of power and some shared principles within the European major powers didn't quite keep the peace in Europe, but did reduce the amount of warfare so that there was no European-wide conflict. In fact, the conflict within the European powers was sufficiently reduced that these European powers, as the new and early industrializing nations of the world, use their new industrial might to go beat up the rest of the world, to create new imperial European powers, to create new European empires that spanned much of the rest of the world while reducing the warfare within Europe. That system of balance of power and principles and norms to reduce the intra-European warfare lasted until the 20th century. But in the first years of the 20th century, principles of peace within Europe gave rise to a new arms race, notably between a rising German state and the British Empire, which was the dominant power of the age, and by 1914 had broken out into a new war within Europe, and because of Europe's imperial reach around the world, what became truly a world war, known to us as World War I, of course. That war killed millions and millions of people with the industrial might of these European armies. When the war ended in 1918, there was a new meeting of the powers, this time at Versailles, to negotiate in 1919 a new Treaty of Versailles. The attempt, once again, as it had been in Vienna in 1815, was to establish new institutions and new rules that would prevent another major war of that devastating kind. And one of the innovations that aimed to serve that purpose was a new League of Nations, established as a new institution based in Geneva, Switzerland, that would keep the peace among powers by finding ways to negotiate peaceful solutions to interstate disputes rather than to have those nations resort to war. A good idea, an idea in the spirit of Immanuel Kant, but as we know, an idea that ultimately, in fact, sooner rather than later, failed, because by the 1930s, the League of Nations was not functioning properly, and the United States, a major economic power by the 1920s and 30s, had not joined the League of Nations. Of course, 20 years after the end of World War I, a second World War, even more devastating in its killing power, and culminating with the dropping of 2 atomic bombs by the United States on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, meant that the Second World War had again destroyed what had been the hopes for the peace after World War I. Fortunately, I would say, and again with the everlasting hope and dream of humanity for a way to peace, a successor institution to the League of Nations was established in 1945, and that, of course, is the United Nations. The United Nations, established in 1945, aimed to create through a new charter, a new United Nations charter, and a set of ethical principles called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted 3 years after the founding of the UN in 1948, a set of principles so that war could be ended, and especially the potential for cataclysmic war in the nuclear age. This is our world today, a world that is still at war, a world that is deeply threatened by the most powerful instruments of destruction ever invented by humanity, a world that is still seeking the set of international institutions, rules, norms, and organizations that can keep the peace. And of course, this is a set of issues that is central to our class and that is absolutely central to our investigation of the ages of globalization and to our search for sustainable development in our time.